I tried not to let my irritation show on my face. With new patients, it is often difficult to maintain a professional, detached demeanor. This is especially true when dealing with people like Katrina. Yes, you heard right. Katrina. That's the devastating hurricane that practically wiped out New Orleans. It's ironic that she has that name, considering what I was beginning to realize about her. She was definitely a force to be reckoned with, and that's still putting it mildly. However, her demeanor was completely inconsistent with her refined feminine appearance. Her nonverbal communication was arrogant and aggressive. Her eyes looked directly at me when she spoke, as if challenging me. She sat in the center of the couch, which in itself was unusual. Most people who get the whole couch usually choose either side with an armrest, but Katrina sat on the center cushion, as if mastering it. Putting one leg over the other, arms crossed in her lap, with a condescending smirk on her face, she sat like she was ready for battle. I think men would call her an ice queen. Others, less tactful, would say bitch queen. It is very common for new patients to feel out of place and nervous. Some feel they have to like the therapist or at least not think badly of him or her. Others want some kind of validation that they were right in what they did or were innocent victims of what happened to them. This makes them defensive. People like Kat compensate for this by showing bravado. Katrina, however, was a little different. Her hostility seemed to be rooted in an inner anger. At the moment, it was directed at her ex-husband. Misdirected was a more appropriate word. One of the most important things I've learned is this. People rarely get angry at what they direct their anger at. It's like a toothache. Sometimes the pain is felt in the wrong tooth. They call it reflected pain, and in my work, anger acts the same way. So Katrina, call me Cat Doc. We've talked about this before. I try to control the flow of the conversation. She insists I call her by her first name, but then calls me Doc instead of Beth or Dr. Carter. She wants me to know that everything is in her hands. Let everything be in her hands, for now. I'm sorry, Kat. You had your first session with me last week. We learned a lot about each other, but we didn't touch on what exactly brought you here. Since you scheduled and came in for a second session, I'm assuming you want to start digging deeper. So why don't we start with why you're here? I noticed her tapping her foot nervously on the floor, which gave away the controlled image she wanted to convey. However, she defiantly rolled her eyes and groaned as if she was annoyed. I'm here because my ex-husband is a wimp. Colorful language for a Stanford-educated woman. She's exaggerating. She's trying to take me out of my comfort zone by going to extremes. All right, Kat. Tell me, what do you mean when you say he's a wimp? I noticed the surprise flashing across her face. I wanted to show her that her antics didn't scare me in the least. Well, Doc, Bran is weak because when we got married, he had no pride. No fight. Her smirk let me know it was intentional. As funny as it is, you never answered the question, I said in an even tone. There was nothing but professionalism on my face, as if I wasn't the least bit bothered by her blatant attempt to steer the train away from its destination. Seeing a silent acknowledgement on her part, I added, But I think you know that yourself, Kat. She was testing the balance of power in our relationship. After all, she was a lawyer. I expected a lot from her. My goal was to show her that this was not a power struggle and certainly not an adversarial hearing. She didn't need to have the upper hand. I wasn't here to change her mind. My job was to help her figure out what had brought her here. Sev, why don't you start by telling me about what upsets you about your ex? I said invitingly. Something resembling sadness flashed across her face. She seemed determined not to show any emotion, so it passed quickly. First of all, he never fought for anything. Every argument ended with him just leaving the room. He didn't even yell back. He would tell me we weren't in a courtroom and I shouldn't beat him up as a hostile witness. She then said mockingly, he had never seen me question a hostile witness. If he had seen it, he would have realized he got off easy. Her tone was full of anger and sarcasm, but something more was heard in it. Regret, sadness, maybe even a little remorse. What do you think he should have done when you two fought? Her face contorted with a mixture of emotions. I don't know. Fight? Yell? Anything. Is that what you think real men do in an argument? Fight and argue? She threw me a look that then turned into a smirk. I see what you're doing, Doc. Next time you'll tell me Bran was right not to argue. She tries to anticipate what I'm going to say in response. It helps her stay calm. Actually, Kat, I was going to agree with you, but for different reasons. Fighting isn't what real men do, but it's what all humans do when they're passionate about something. They fight to protect what they care about. People often think that the perfect relationship is one where there are no disagreements or fights. In fact, it is quite the opposite. If two people never argue about anything, it can only mean one of three things. The first is that one or both people in the relationship are not being completely honest about what is bothering them. They are just agreeing for the sake of peace. 2. One or both people don't care enough about the relationship to waste energy arguing. 3. One person in the relationship is repressed into total submission. The look of surprise on her face told me I had caught her off guard. She was having trouble picking out a response. I didn't want to turn this into an argument, so I changed course. Tell me, what made you fall in love with Brandon? It took her a couple seconds to realize the new direction. She raised her eyes to the ceiling and pressed her lips together as if pondering. Without noticing it herself, she frowned slightly and her lips curved into a smile. Almost. Bran was kind. The kindest man I've ever known, and he was patient with me. He didn't call me bossy like so many other men in my life. He appreciated my responsible nature. How did you two communicate with each other? She laughed in relief at remembering that. It wasn't a sarcastic laugh like before. Rather, it reminded her of herself. Brandon didn't have a problem with socializing. We could talk about anything for hours. The smile slowly left her face and her voice broke when she said, "At least at first." "What did you two talk about when things were good?" I asked, trying to bring her back to happier memories. It was probably a little selfish of me, but I liked seeing the lack of a wistful expression on her face. Everything. Movies, people, politics, my job. It doesn't matter. Even if he didn't know what he was talking about, he could talk about it. She grinned. There was never a dull moment with him. "Why do you think he fell in love with you?" I asked. I realized too late that it was a mistake. The smirk returned to her face and her eyes looked at me with challenge again. Because I was having so much fun that he realized it couldn't get any better. Plus, I took care of his lazy ass. If it wasn't for me, he'd be another broke writer who can't feed himself. I silently reprimanded myself. I unwittingly let her retreat into her aggressive, condescending wall. However, I noticed something that might prove useful. She was trying to dodge a sarcastic answer because she probably can't think of what to say to that question. I decided to give her a little nudge. "So you fell in love with him because he was smart, funny, kind, patient, and appreciated you for who you were. And he only fell in love with you because you were good in bed and paid the bills? Is that how you view your relationship?" I paused to let him comprehend what I'd said, and then continued to shock him again. "It sounds like you got a better deal out of the marriage." She looked at me incredulously and asked, "How did you figure that out?" "Well, if what you say is true, then you fell in love with a man who was patient with you and loved you for who you were. You could talk to him about things that interested you. But all he got was a nice mommy who laid down well." That made her come to her senses a little. It made her think about the real answer. The smirk disappeared. "I think he liked my openness. He told me he liked my brutal honesty because he always knows where he stands. I didn't play word games or try to spare his feelings. I said what I meant." Her face frowned. I also noticed she hesitated at the word brutal honesty. I focused on that. "Have you always been honest with him?" She looked at the floor. A very important moment because I felt like this was the real beginning for us. "Yes, always, even when it hurt." She said it in a much softer voice than usual. "When did you hurt him, Kat?" I could see the walls crumbling. My intuition told me it was too good to be true. It was too fast. I hit the mark because Katrina jerked back. Instantly, she retreated to her safe place, and her implacable lawyer lurked behind her back. "Who gives a shit? We're already divorced, so there's no point in talking about it." She crossed her arms defiantly and stared at me. She resembled a small child who had been told he or she had to apologize to a sibling. "Well, obviously you care. If you didn't, you wouldn't be here." I saw signs that she was fighting the tsunami of emotions that threatened to crash over her. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she averted her gaze. She avoided any eye contact with me. Why don't you tell me about how you hurt Brandon? I said in a comforting but commanding tone. Then I let the air fill with silence. Katrina left my question unanswered. She wanted to wait for me to change the subject, but I had the advantage. Even in her silence, I could read body language that spoke louder than she could scream at the full capacity of her lungs. She wanted to tell me about this. She needed to. Restrained feelings were screaming to be heard. They were hiding beneath the surface and fighting her need to hold herself back to break free. I knew that once she realized this wasn't a power struggle, she'd humble herself and open up. Okay, fine, she finally said. I was honest with him when I was having fun with another man. I told him about it and then divorced him. Are you happy now? She searched my face for any reaction, but I didn't say anything back. I remained neutral. It was important for her to see that nothing she said could shock me. It would help her feel comfortable. Describe him, I said nonchalantly. Who, Terry? She asked. Of course I meant Terry. She knew that. It was a time-dragging tactic. Yes, I'd like to hear about Terry. What attracted you to him? Katrina took a deep breath and raised her eyes to the ceiling again. This time the smile was more prominent on her face than when she was talking about her husband. Terry was a coworker. He's a lawyer too. She paused, remembering. God, that man just owns the courtroom. He can make the judge and opposing counsel eat out of his hands. He's got this swagger about him. It's like he knows that no matter what, he's going to get his way. He has a commanding presence, I said. It wasn't a question. I paraphrased her words to give them more context. She nodded. Oh yeah, he's the only person who's ever intimidated me. We were both vying for the title of senior partner. I see, that's the intimidation you felt. Did it attract you? Encouraged you to give in to it? I think so, yes. It was very arousing. No man has ever made me feel that way, including Bran. She leaned forward and ran her fingers over her thumbs. All the men I dated were always inferior to me. Several of my ex-boyfriends became vegetarians just because I told them that as long as they were with me, they wouldn't eat meat. Even if they didn't like it, they ate it for me. Bran didn't go that far, but he was pretty much on par with the rest of us. Terry wasn't like that. He was more like me. He didn't stand in line, he started it. Nothing could get in the way of what he wanted to do. He could get people to follow him simply because he told them to. I loved Brandon, I really did. But sometimes, just sometimes, I wished he was the same. You know? I understand, I said, taking a few notes. Did you see Terry as more of a man than Brandon? She thought for a few seconds. I wouldn't say that. What would you say? I could see the thoughts swirling around in her head. Terry was more, I don't know, imposing, I guess. Powerful. It drew me in. And those are the qualities you think Brandon lacked? Yes. I took a few more notes. Okay, Kat, let's switch gears. Tell me the story. I want to hear about the first time you crossed the line with Terry. Her eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Cross the line? What do you mean? I smiled to myself. I had deliberately used the overt expression cross the line instead of cheated on my husband. Most people associate cheating with a physical act. That's how they justify all the little things that lead up to it. Flirting, sexual innuendos, etc. Compared to that, everything seems innocent. The fact that she asked me to elaborate means that some part of her knew that even those little things could be seen as inappropriate. I want you to tell me whatever comes into your head. Don't think about it too hard. Whatever comes into your head, go along with it. Start talking before your internal filter goes off. She thought about it some more, then said, Okay, I think the first time will be the most successful. Good, tell me about the bet. Cat, 5 years ago. I leaned back in my chair and rolled my eyes when there was an annoying noise in the air. Oh, Phil, I said in an amused voice, interrupting the noise. I love how you try to talk tough, like you really have a case. It would be adorable if it weren't so annoying. But okay, we both know you have nothing to fall back on. He launched into another pouty monologue about laws and bylaws, which didn't help his position one bit. He only filled the dead air with loud words that were meant to inspire fear. As if on cue, the paralegal I'd been waiting for brought me a real bylaw relevant to the case, not some made-up one that might have applied in 1995. I pointed to the phone. making it clear that I needed her for this particular conversation. She smiled quietly as she opened the manila folder and tapped her finger on the highlighted section. Kat, my client wants to, Phil began, his annoying voice coming through the speakerphone. I didn't care at all what his client wanted, so I interrupted him. Phil, please stop talking. Your voice is annoying, and my stomach hurts from being fed nonsense. Apparently, your paralegals aren't worth a damn. Fortunately, ours are top-notch. So I took the liberty of asking them to do your work for you. Having said that, I winked playfully at the paralegal who was handing me the papers. She smiled broadly at my praise. I'm going to email you some bylaws that should interest you. Please read them. As much as I love embarrassing you in court, it gets tiresome. How many times have you lost against me already? The line fell silent for the first time since he had called me with his client's demands. Then he spoke bitterly. You're a real bitch, Kat. Yes, that's right. 3 times. And I could feel him seething on the other end of the wire. Screw you. Do you understand? Screw you. He bellowed, showing off his extensive education from Columbia University. It'll be done, Phil. Kiss my wife for me. Ta-ta. I muttered with contrived cheerfulness, hanging up the phone. I then closed the manila folder in front of me and scribbled a few instructions on the front of it. Sonia, give this to Kim and tell her to email it to these people. And close the door behind you, please. Nodding, Sonia took the folder and walked out. I exhaled noisily and leaned back in my chair, enjoying the silence. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was only 10:30 in the morning. Brandon must have gotten out of bed by now. It's nice that I can wake up whenever I want. People with real jobs don't have that luxury. I decided to take a moment and call to check on him. I pulled out my cell phone and found his number on my favorites list. Hi, kitty cat, he said, picking up after the third ring. Hey, babe, how was your day? I asked in a machine-like manner. I didn't really listen to the answer because I knew exactly what he was going to say. We had this conversation in one form or another almost every day. At this point, he would tell me either about a publisher that had rejected his book, a publisher he was still waiting to hear back from, or a new publisher he was going to talk to. Every now and then, he would tell me about a new short story he was writing, which in turn will be rejected in the future. While I was talking to him, my cell phone buzzed in my office, indicating that my secretary was trying to reach me. I muted it and pressed the button to speak to her. Brandon kept talking, and I knew I had a few minutes before I had to answer. Like I said, we talked about this on a daily basis. Yes, Kim. Mr. Ross is here to see you. I smiled to myself and rolled my eyes. Terry. Of course he was here. No doubt the reason for his visit was to gloat and stroke my face over the fact that he'd won our little bet. We had a whale we were both trying to catch on a fishing line named Mr. Wellington. This guy was a lawyer's dream. He was a walking lawsuit and a Fortune 500 company VIP. He had so many billable hours that he probably would have saved a fortune by opening a law firm and devoting it to his cases. It seemed like a burden to his company, but he was bringing them money. It was not in their best interest to let him go, but to continue to represent him properly. Terry and I pursued this guy relentlessly. We both realized that once we got him, we could become senior partner. The rivalry became so intense that Terry proposed a bet. The loser had to make the winner coffee every day for a month whenever he wanted. Whether it was a board meeting or just a meeting with a client, the loser had to suffer the humiliation of stopping all his business and going for coffee. I thought I had the upper hand in this battle. Since many of Mr. Wellington's cases involved inappropriate behavior with women, I strategically decided it was in his best interest to have a female face handle his defense. I looked good on camera, and people often responded well to me, so my presence would really help his PR. What I hadn't counted on was that Mr. Wellington would be so forthright. His ego drove him to not even hide it. When I first met him and his wife, I wondered how she had any brain cells left after all that snorting. Within an hour of meeting him, I realized that this was the only way she could keep her marriage with him intact. I realized I was in for an uphill battle with him when he started calling me honey buns and sweet cakes. He was a fat bastard, but he wasn't referring to his addiction to sweets. Later, Terry jokingly told me to be grateful that he didn't call me meat in my blouse, as he had done to a former employee who was now suing him. Long story short, Terry won both the client and the argument. I hated losing, but I was glad I didn't have to constantly defend this misogynistic asshole. I was a lawyer, and a damn good one. But I was also a woman. Hey, 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 Bran, I said quickly, trying to break through his memorized script and get his attention. Let me call you back. I'm about to be with a client. Okay. It was a little white lie. I didn't even have to say it. It was just easier for me to say that I had a client coming to see me instead of another lawyer. It was business related anyway. Kind of like, okay, kitty cat, I'll see you tonight. Love you. Love you too, bye, I said hastily and disconnected. Then I pressed the button on my work phone again and said, send him in. A few seconds later, Terry walked in and closed the door behind him. I watched as he took a seat in front of my desk with a confident grin and crossed his legs, resting his ankle on his knee. What can I do for you, Terry? I asked in an indifferent tone, as if he was annoyed with me. He grinned and rubbed his chin. Coffee light, 2 hazelnut creams, 3 packets of Splenda. Splenda? Are you watching your girly figure? No, Stephanie just likes it that way. I decided to buy the secretary a cup for a change. You know, to show my appreciation. It's the least I can do. He said it with a smugness masquerading as genuine disinterest. Your favor knows no bounds, I said dryly, rolling my eyes and stood up. I walked to my door to leave the office. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that he followed me all the way out. Terry and I often exchanged barbs in the office. We often exchanged barbs berating each other. But everyone knows that when 2 people yell at each other, it's just a thin veil for flirting. Underneath it all, there was mutual respect as well as physical attraction. I stopped at my door and turned around. You're not going to drag me into this ridiculous bet, are you? He chuckled again. You know, Kat, I get what you're saying, but I'm still short on caffeine. How about we fix that? He finished the sentence with an exaggerated wink and a click of his teeth. I groaned loudly. Great. I'll be right back, I said through clenched teeth. As I walked out, I heard him playfully address me. Have courage, Blouse. I jabbed a finger at his shoulder in response. I seriously considered putting something in his coffee, maybe some Molochs or something. I gave in the name of good sportsmanship, but it was very difficult. Instead, I handed him back his coffee as he demanded. Enjoy, I said critically, holding out the coffee to him. I sat back down at my desk and smirked, looking at him, daring him to take a sip. I was trying to piss him off. I hadn't put anything in his cup, but he didn't know that. He stared at me incredulously for a while, then took a hesitant sip. When he realized there was no poison in the drink, he looked at me again with that damn smirk. Wow, counselor, I must say you make a very tasty coffee. We should have made this bet a long time ago. Stephanie is going to love it. Eat me, I said without thinking. The moment threatened to be awkward, but Terry played it off masterfully. Such unfeminine language. Do you kiss your husband with that mouth? He said, dodging the rising tension. I was a little disappointed that he didn't respond with a volley. Most men wouldn't have missed such an opportunity to flirt. This time, I deliberately took it to the next level. Leaning forward, I gave him a smoldering look and said, You'd be surprised to know what I can do with my mouth. That got his attention. He looked at me curiously, trying to figure out if I had said that. When I didn't look confused, he replied, Honestly, Kat, I wouldn't be surprised by anything from you. You are a woman of many talents. My ego was stroked, and I poured a pitcher of cold water on him to cool him down. Good. You may now leave my office and hand your secretary my perfect coffee. The quick change in temperature knocked him out of it for a second. Then he laughed, rising from his chair. You can be a bitch sometimes. You know about that? Heard about it, I said, winking at him and snapping at him the way he snapped at me. He shook his head with a final smirk and headed for my door. He was about to walk out but stopped. He turned around and looked at me with a twinkle in his eyes. What if I give you another way to pay your bet? Curious, I leaned back in my chair. I'm listening. He thought for a second, as if trying to decide whether to say what he was thinking. Then he asked slyly, What kind of underwear are you wearing? This time it was my turn to flinch at the unexpectedly abrupt turn of the conversation. Excuse me? I exclaimed incredulously. What was that incomprehensible thing I said? My mouth dropped open. You're kidding, right? He didn't say anything. Didn't apologize, didn't try to justify himself. He just stood still, as if seriously waiting for my answer. It's none of your damn business. It just happened, I finally said. He smirked and let out a small chuckle as if he knew something I didn't. Okay, okay. He raised his hands in a sign of surrender. But if you go and send me the picture, I might be able to convince you to go back to making Stephanie make her own coffee. Then he strode away toward the door, leaving me puzzled. You're crazy, I said. I noticed that there wasn't a hint of mirth or anger in my voice. It sounded more like amusement. It's just a thought, he said, finally opening the door and leaving. I sat in my empty office and shook my head. This man had a lot of nerve. He was married, for crying out loud. I'd met Christina more than once. He was also acquainted with my husband. None of these circumstances prevented him from making an absurd request. And yet I couldn't help but be struck by his audacity. I should have been more offended, but I wasn't. Surprisingly, I was a little flattered. Terry seemed attractive to me. Any woman who wasn't a full-blown lesbian would have found him. He was handsome, driven, successful. He always smelled nice. And he could talk. It makes a man feel good to know that someone he finds attractive feels the same way. I thought about his proposal. What should have been an immediate hell no turned into an argument between me and my conscience. After all, he hadn't asked me to entertain him. I grabbed my phone and sent him a quick text. Do you have Instagram? A few minutes later, he replied with a link. I checked it and saw that it was his account. And then, I can't believe I'm actually going to do this, I thought, as I walked out of the office and headed to the ladies' room. Dr. Carter, present tense. Katrina sat on the couch with a pensive look, having finished her story. Hearing the story told in her own voice seemed to keep her in suspense. Undoubtedly, she had filed the event away in the back of her mind as insignificant. It had nothing to do with the outcome of her marriage. It was an entirely separate event. At least that's what she'd probably been telling herself until now. So, Kat, you sent him your provocative pictures. I assume he liked them. Her contemplative look turned into a confident smile. Of course he liked them. He's a bloody man. I find it interesting that you've allowed yourself to be relegated to the level of a sexual object. You strike me as someone who has fought long and hard to be treated just the opposite. The smile left her face as she thought for a moment. That's the thing, Dr. Carter. I didn't see Terry treating me as an object. I turned my attention to the fact that she finally called me Dr. Carter. By this time, her wall had almost completely crumbled. That hard, tough as nails, cynical woman who had walked into the office was no longer there, at least for the moment. Her entire personality had changed. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable with me. I see. I nodded. I didn't completely agree with her, but I understood what she was getting at. And you liked the attention? Every woman wants to be desired. And Brandon? Didn't he make you feel desirable? She took a deep breath and moved her hair out of her face. It was different with Brandon. He used to call me beautiful all the time. So what changed Terry so much? I don't know, she said with disappointment in her voice. For a while we sat in silence, as if taking a short break. Kat stared blankly into space while her thoughts darted around for answers. Did you see Brandon as your equal? Of course, she replied nonchalantly. He was my husband. Being a husband doesn't mean you're an equal. Earlier you called Brandon a less worthy man. I did not say that, she interrupted sharply. I was a little surprised at the vehemence with which she did so. It seemed inappropriate. You've said several times that you wished he'd become a man. That's just a saying, Doc. I didn't actually call him less of a man, she replied as soon as the words were off my lips. Her tone was judicious. Well, I was back to being a doc again. She doesn't like the thought of undermining Brandon. Odd, considering her attitude toward him. Kat, I think you called him a wuss, she said. Yes, well, she stuttered incoherently. When she couldn't come up with a rebuttal, a look of defeat appeared on her face. Her eyes began to water. Sir, what did you mean when you called him those names? I asked after a moment's silence. I don't know, she replied, as one of the tears rolled down her cheek. I guess Trina was right. I humiliated him. But I wasn't trying to, I just wanted him to be motivated. What did you want Brandon to be motivated to do? I don't know. Something. Anything. He had so much potential. He was just wasting it, waiting for the right person to read his stories. Do you know how hurt and ashamed I was? Now we were beginning to understand. Ashamed? Yes, ashamed, she said. Here I was, a successful, tough lawyer. At work, I was a shark. People looked up to me. People were afraid of me. Colleagues respected me. I fought every obstacle people put in front of me like Rocky freaking Balboa. And then they'd ask me what my husband was doing. She paused and let out a small, cynical chuckle. I'd answer them that he was a writer. Then they'd say, "Uh-oh, a writer. What did he write?" And do you know what I'd have to tell them? Nothing. I finished the sentence for her, sympathy filling my voice. I knew I should have let her talk, but sympathy took over. Honestly, I could feel her frustration. I was a successful therapist. I had written several books myself and was highly respected. My husband owned his own carpentry business, which was very successful. He had started it in a garage with his best friend. He now had 3 different offices around the state. He was discussing with his accountant about opening a 4th. When people would ask me what he did for a living, I would proudly tell them about it. I like to brag about it. Most women like to brag about their husband's accomplishments. Even successful women like to brag about their men. Kat nodded her head sadly. Yeah, it's no big deal. Like he was my stay-at-home wife. We didn't have kids, so I couldn't even use the stay-at-home dad argument. After a while, I just avoided conversations where people might ask about him. Trina doesn't understand this. Her husband is a bodybuilder and fitness trainer. She can be proud of him. Hell, all she has to do is show a picture of him shirtless and people will absolutely not care what he does for a living. Trina? I asked. Kat looked confused for a second and I said, "You've mentioned a person named Trina twice now, like I should know who she is, but..." A light bulb went on in her head. Ah, yes. I'm sorry, Dr. Carter. Trina is one of my best friends. We went to Stanford Law School together. She works in the DA's office now. We're both named Katrina. People used to confuse us all the time, so we asked everyone to call me Kat since she mostly addressed Trina. I see. I see, I said. There was something familiar about a woman named Trina working for the district attorney, but there was no way I could grasp it. Since you're talking about your husband's flaws, I'm wondering why you married him in the first place. What attracted you to him? A rare smile reappeared on her face. Brandon was sweet and caring. He was the kind of man who drives to the store for ice cream at 3 in the morning just because I can't sleep. Yes. And how was the sex life? Her smile turned fake. Bran was pretty damn good. She laughed and nodded. He was very skillful with his mouth, and he was a good conversationalist. We both laughed at her joke. It was nice to see her reminiscing about the good times with her ex. It would help her not to blame him for everything that he had ruined their marriage. So your problems with him stemmed from the dissatisfaction you felt because of his lack of ambition. You wanted him to be successful at something like you were. It wasn't so much about his job. I was earning enough to support both of us. I just wanted to be proud of him, you know? Men think their wives should be proud to call them husband, even if they don't do a damn thing. We're supposed to swoon and fawn before them, no matter how much or how little they do. Yes and no. I paused to gather my thoughts. I had one more way to present this to her, and I was trying to decide the best way to do it. Do you mind if I give my point of view on this? Not at all, Dr. Carter. That's what I'm paying you for. Touching. You work hard to stay attractive, don't you? Yes, I do. Good. How would you feel if your husband was self-conscious about the way you look? What if, because of his dissatisfaction with your appearance, he was embarrassed to show people pictures of you or mention you in conversation? Would that be hurtful? Of course it would. I don't see the correlation. Well, you do expect your husband to be proud to call you his wife, right? Even if you were a 250-pound woman working at Walmart. Wouldn't you expect him to be happy that you are his wife? Would you justify cheating on him by saying you weren't pretty enough? Those are completely different things, Dr. Carter. It's apples and oranges. No, Kat, it's apples and apples. We women often subconsciously judge our potential partners by how confident they are. In prehistoric times, men were required to be able to hunt, build a house, or build a fire. These days, we judge confidence by how important their career is. A higher-paying job usually means it is more important. In today's society, Women are taking their lives into their own hands and looking for those jobs rather than relying on men. However, when choosing a mate, we still look for a man whose job title is equivalent or higher than ours. We want to have our cake and eat it too. Intellectually, we should realize that if we are at the top of our profession, our significant other often cannot be. But we're made to expect it anyway. Okay, she said, waiting for me to connect the dots. Well, men usually have a more primitive criterion: physical beauty. The more beautiful a wife is, the more she is honored by those who look at marriage from the outside. In prehistoric times, a woman's physical body determined how capable she was of bearing and raising children. Men remained men. We both laughed a little before continuing. Of course, there are other factors that influence a couple's choice. Modern society has changed the way we look at things in many ways, but if we're being honest, those are the first things men and women look for in each other. Still don't see where you're going with this, Doc. Well, you could make the argument that being embarrassed by your husband's lack of ambition is almost the same as him being embarrassed by your looks. She looked at me thoughtfully for a moment. Then she made a grimace and said, No, no offense, Dr. Carter, but I don't agree with you at all. Good, agree to disagree. Be that as it may, your dissatisfaction with your husband led you to cheat on him. No matter what perspective you look at it from, you still dealt your marriage a huge blow, one that you've never been able to recover from. But no, Kat, it was you who did it, not him. You. I did, she said quietly as the tears began to flow. I did. She put her head in her lap and began to cry loudly. Her shoulders shook and her body shook with sobs. I sat silently, letting my emotions overwhelm her. She needed this. As much pain as she was in, she needed this. I didn't mean to hurt him, Dr. Carter, I really didn't. I was just so disappointed in him that I couldn't even look at him still. But I never meant to hurt him. I know, Kat, I said comfortingly, holding out a napkin to her. But you have to accept that you hurt him. You have to accept it. It's easy to write it off as him being a wimp. When you do that, you justify yourself by saying he deserved it. But no matter what, you can't hold him responsible for your choices. You made your own choices by cheating on him and distancing yourself from him. You may have tried to motivate him in the beginning, but somewhere along the line you gave up on him. Admit it. I don't want to, Dr. Carter. I don't want to be that person. I felt it was time to get her talking again. I didn't want this to turn into a student-teacher session where she obediently listened while I spoke. She seemed to be suffocating in this conversation. Tell me, Kat, how has your attraction to Terry affected your life at home? How have things escalated? Kat snorted and took a deep breath. Well, Kat. My life changed slowly, 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 and then bam. And nothing was ever the same again. At the office, I expected there to be awkwardness between Terry and me. Surprisingly, that didn't happen. There was some shyness at first. The reason wasn't so much about the picture I'd sent him. After all, he'd only seen my bra. It was the fact that I wasn't sure what he was expecting. I was drawn to him, but I didn't want to have an affair. But when we saw each other, he pretended like nothing had happened. There was no awkward attempts at conversation. He just jumped on me like he always did. I did the same, and things continued as usual. That's not to say there wasn't a spark. We still flirted with each other when no one was looking. During meetings, I would catch his gaze lingering on me. Then he would smile a knowing smile when he saw me noticing him. To compensate, our competitiveness increased. I didn't hesitate to poach clients from him every chance I got. I would even steal Mr. Wellington from him if I had the opportunity. We still competed with each other for the title of senior partner. Underneath it all, however, were our primal desires. Anticipation. I relished the fact that his eyes scoured my body from head to toe at every opportunity. I pretended not to notice anything, just as he pretended not to notice me inhaling the subtle scent of his cologne. But we didn't take the next step. For one thing, I was still happily married. Mostly. Brandon was an unmotivated dreamer, wasting his potential waiting for the right person to read his novels, but he was still my lover. I wasn't sure if Terry showed the same restraint I did. He and his secretary seemed to be feeling, shall we say, a little too comfortable. They tried to pretend and appear professional when others were around, but there was something about their interactions that set the rumor mill in motion. A certain familiarity that seemed a little less professionally appropriate. Believe it or not, office romances were commonplace in our office. No one blinked an eye, even if the people were married. We spent more time in the office than we did at home. Spouses don't realize the stress and workload that lawyers have to deal with. The late nights, the early morning meetings, the fast-paced hustle and bustle, all of these things take their toll. Often, spouses can inadvertently add to this stress. They complain that you are not home and feel lonely. At the same time, they spend your money and drive luxury cars that you, of course, paid for. The only people who understand them are people with a similar profession. So it's only natural that they find comfort in an office where we all get them. Another reason I think Terry and I didn't pamper ourselves at that time was the rivalry that existed between us. We both wanted to get the upper hand on each other so that neither of us could take the next step. I certainly wasn't going to chase after him. How desperate would a married woman look running after another man, especially if he couldn't do anything for her that she couldn't do for herself? No matter what you say, society stigmatizes male adulterers and female adulterers differently. A married man pursuing a woman is an unreliable dog, and a married woman pursuing a man is a desperate and needy bitch, and an unreliable one at that. I was neither. So I suppressed my illicit desire and contented myself with flirting at arm's length. Terry seemed content to do the same. And so it went on for about a year. By then I was staying late at work almost every night. Brandon was getting more and more annoyed with me. No matter what I said or did, he didn't want to get up and do what he needed to do. He was so complacent that it was annoying me. It got to the point where I stopped feeling desire for him and didn't want to be around him. And what frustrated me the most was that he thought he was doing everything he could to get his books published and saw no logic. My reasoning was that either he was lazy and not doing everything he could, or his books really weren't that good and no amount of effort would help him realize his dream. Either way, I thought he should take the bait and do something else. Maybe take up writing on the side. But he was committed to this fantasy, so he put all his eggs in one basket. And that repulsed me. Disliking Brandon made him less physically attractive to me. Did that make sense? After all, nothing had changed about his body. He was still doing the same things he'd always done. But something was missing, at least for me. One night, when I often stayed up late, Brandon's situation didn't stop my body's natural urges. All it did was cause me frustration. I was used to suppressing that feeling, but it wouldn't go away. It was just simmering. On this night, it wasn't just boiling, it was bubbling. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door of my room. "Come in!" I shouted, remembering that my assistant had gone home for the day. The door opened and Terry walked into the room. "I thought I saw your car in the parking lot," he said. "Don't you ever drive home?" "Well, there must be at least one lawyer here to fill in for you. The only time I see you working is when you're pretending to be a lawyer to poach my clients." He grinned. "Just because I fake it easily doesn't mean I don't work. It's just that I get it right the first time, and I don't need to stay here to fix mistakes. No, you stay here to entertain your secretary." He threw me an amused look that said, "Uh-oh, fine." Then he sat down in the chair in front of my desk. "Well, now she's not here and I am. What's the reason?" "I don't know, Terry. Why are you still here?" He didn't answer anything. Instead, he stood up and stepped forward until we were within a few centimeters of each other. "Stop, Kat, stop." My conscience was pleading with me. But one step at a time, and we got down to business. As corny as it sounds, I didn't feel guilty until I drove home. At the office, I showered and cleaned up. The executive restrooms had showers, so that when I came out, no one would have guessed it. My makeup was applied, my hair was styled, my clothes were tidy. I just felt different. Everything was different now. In the last 20 minutes, my perspective on my entire marriage had changed dramatically. I wanted a divorce. I loved Brandon. I loved him so much. But I couldn't be married to him anymore. Being his wife would suck more out of my life than I put into it. That night was the final nail in the coffin. The fact that I was having fun with another man proved that I didn't want to be in this marriage. When I got home, I caught him in the living room. He was sitting on the couch with his laptop on his lap. There was a documentary on TV about the fall of the Roman Empire. "Hi, kitty cat," he said when he saw me walk in. There's still Chinese food in the fridge if you're hungry. I brought you some General Tao and lo mein chicken. And then I walked past him and sat down on a chair instead of the couch. Seeing my face, he realized something was wrong. What's wrong, Kat? He asked, and his face showed worry in the creases on his forehead. I took a deep breath as a single tear rolled down my face. Bran, we need to talk. Dr. Carter, present tense. Wow, you told him everything? Just like that? I asked, genuinely surprised. Just like that, she repeated. I even told him about the pictures Terry sent. Wow, was all I could say. Most people usually only confess when they need to. They usually refrain until they're caught or about to be caught. And how did he react? Got angry, lost his temper. He yelled, screamed, called me all sorts of words. Funny thing is, it was the first time he really showed that side of him. And you? What do you think I did? I yelled back, of course. I called him… What? A wimp, she said quickly. You said that? To his face? I asked in bewilderment. She nodded sadly. I know. I'm a bitch. You can say it. I wasn't going to say it. But Brandon can definitely make that argument, I joked. That got her a half smile. Oh, he did make that argument, very loudly. It's still ringing in my ears. So where were we? What happened next? Kat, 3 years ago. The room seemed so familiar, I had to remind myself that I wasn't here for work. I was here to finalize my divorce. For months after my confession, Brandon and I lived like two ghosts. We were physically in the same house, but we couldn't really see or touch each other. I would come home from work and the only evidence of his presence was the empty food containers in the trash. We might not see each other for weeks. We never talked about how we were going to sleep, so I took the initiative and moved into the guest bedroom. It felt like the right thing to do, after all. I was the one who had instigated the change. He didn't make a single argument against it. What's more, he didn't say a word to me at all. The next time we spoke privately was when Mike, my attorney, handed me the divorce papers to give to Brandon. I could have handed them to him while I was at work, but I felt like I should do him the courtesy of giving him the papers myself. So I decided to leave early and drove home. I wanted to make sure I caught Brandon off guard. I had a suspicion that he would run to the bedroom to hide when he sensed I would be back soon to avoid me. I got home a full 4 hours earlier than planned and found him in the living room again. He wasn't fast enough to disappear from me. Again, as if in déjà vu, I sat down in the chair. I tossed the papers on the coffee table in front of me. Is that what I think it is? He asked, not even taking his eyes off the screen. All I managed to mutter was a yes. He tried to look neutral and nonchalant, but for a moment I could see the resentment on his face. Then, without another word, he picked up the envelope, pulled out the papers, and silently read them. I felt a little embarrassed that I was just sitting there while he read, so I got up and walked away from him. Before I reached the door, he said, "No, take them back." "What?" I asked. "Take them back, I'm not signing them." He repeated, putting them back on the coffee table. I was at a loss. I don't know what reaction I was expecting, but it wasn't what I expected. This arrangement was more than fair. He was keeping his BMW, which he was paying for himself. He stayed on my health insurance until he got his own. I even paid him alimony. A lot of alimony. It was enough to allow him to fulfill his pathetic dream and still live in relative prosperity. What more could he want? What do all abusive spouses want? It's never about money. It's usually about making the other person suffer. I didn't want to fight him in court. I really didn't. Not because I was afraid of losing. Quite the opposite. It was because I'd win. And crush him in the process. Bran, please. Don't make this any more painful than it has to be. I know I hurt you and I'm sorry, but trust me. You don't want to take this to trial. That's why I set your alimony so high. If you go to court, the judge will give you a lot less than you're getting now. For the first time, he turned to look at me. His eyes were full of angry tears. Hate lurked behind them. You'd think this was about money, he grinned. No, it's not about your money. I'm not signing this because I want you to draw up a new document. In this document, I don't want you to give me anything. Huh? I don't want anything from you. No alimony, no car, no insurance, nothing, he said with disgust in his voice. I want to pretend you never came into my life. I want it to be like I never met you. But how will you live? Not your problem. You've already signed me up as a useless husband you have to support. Change the document and I'll sign it. After that, I promise you will never have to endure attachment to me again. Bran, think about what you're saying, I pleaded with him. Most people would have jumped up and run out of the room before he changed his mind, but I didn't. After everything we'd been through, I didn't want him to starve to death because of wounded pride. Katrina, get out of my sight, he said nonchalantly, turning back to the computer in front of him. All I could do was pick up the papers and head to my room. Now we were here to finalize things. No matter how much the lawyer pleaded with Brandon, he wouldn't give in. I tried several times to convince him of the logic, but was met with venomous anger at every turn. In the end, I gave in. So be it. If he doesn't want my money, I'm not going to keep begging him to take it. I signed my part of the paperwork. My lawyer slid the papers across the table to his side. Brandon and his lawyer whispered for a few seconds, and then the lawyer shook his head and handed Bran a pen. Bran was about to sign, but something made him stop. His pen hovered over the paper as if in indecision. Then he looked up at me. When our eyes met, I saw the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, the man I thought I would grow old with. I loved you, Kat. I really did, he said sadly. Tears ran down my cheeks as I looked up at him. His eyes clouded over as well. We sat like that, a chasm of regret between us. Then, shaking his head dejectedly, he scribbled his name in the appropriate places. Without another word, he stood up and quickly left the room. Dr. Carter, present tense. Kat couldn't hold back her tears by the end of her story. It was hard for me to remain impassive. I felt Kat's pain as she relived the regrets of that time in her life. I even felt Brandon's pain, even though he wasn't here to tell his side of the story. I couldn't imagine what it was like to be rejected by a spouse who didn't think you were good enough. How long ago did you get divorced? I asked. She snorted and wiped her nose with the other napkin I'd given her when she was in the middle of her story. 3 years? That seems like a long time. Is this the first time you've grieved the end of your marriage? Not really. After it ended, I took 2 weeks of vacation. I took a cruise to the Bahamas to get away from home. Even with Bran's things gone, there were traces of his presence everywhere. There was still his detergent in the bedroom bathroom. The pillows still smelled of his aftershave. The refrigerator still held the food he liked to eat. I didn't have the heart to rid the house of him completely, so I left and paid the maid extra to do it while I was gone. Was the cruise fun? It was fun at times. I drank a lot. I was entertained a couple times by some guy. He was at least 6 or 7 years younger than me. I'll admit he was a good distraction. He had a lot of stamina. I also visited a few clubs, ate exotic food at restaurants, and bought a bunch of stuff I didn't need at all. But when I got back to the room, all I could think about was my marriage. How did you feel when you went back to work? She laughed out loud. While I was away, it was announced that Terry was the new senior partner, so I came back to this pleasant surprise. Ironic, isn't it? Indeed. It must have been a blow, considering everything that's happened. She snorted angrily. It was. Really was. That's why I quit. Wait, what? You quit? I asked, unable to hide the surprise in my voice. She laughed again. Yes, quit my job. Maybe I was still grieving my marriage and couldn't think clearly. I don't know. I was very emotional. But when I heard the news, I just lost my temper, Jerry Maguire style. When I left, I caused quite a stir. They're probably still talking about it to this day. Wow, that was all I could say. I hadn't expected that part of the story. Do you regret it? About what? Quitting your job or divorcing Bran? Both. She thought for a second before saying, yes, I regret it. So what brings you here after all this time? I expected it to be sooner. She reached into her purse, which she had placed beside her on the couch, and pulled out a crumpled, tattered piece of paper that looked like a brochure. She placed it on the coffee table between us. I picked it up and read it. It was the program for a play called The Woman in the Cave. What's this? I asked. She snatched it out of my hands, unfolded it on the back, and pointed to the title. She pointed to the author. It was Brandon's play. She leaned back in her chair and told me about it. It's about a man who gets trapped in a cave during a storm. He's trapped in there with a woman. While the storm rages outside, he and the woman talk to pass the time. He tells her stories from his life. Unfortunately, she's a real mean bitch. She constantly tells him everything that is wrong with every story he tells. She calls him weak and pathetic and chides him every chance she gets. At first, he gets mad at her. They yell and fight. Then he begins to believe he is worthless. Finally, near the end, he begins to realize how much potential he has. He realizes that this woman's only goal is to destroy him. When he finally confronts her and tells her that no matter what she says, he will no longer believe her, she disappears and the storm subsides. Then he realizes that she was a figment of his imagination. Wow, that was all I could say for the billionth time today. He plays for a week, then he takes it to another city. Most critics have given the play rave reviews. There's even a rumor that he's got another one ready to go. And reading the program, I looked up to see where the play was taking place. You do realize it's 2 hours away, right? Yes, I know. I do realize. I take it you've already been there to see it. She nodded. How many times? 3. Every time I cry. Really? Why? She wiped the moisture from her cheeks. I don't know. I guess I hate to think about what I did to him. When I see the woman in the cave breaking the protagonist at every turn, it just makes me twitch. If that's how Bran sees me, then I must have been a real monster. Do you ever see him there? Every time. And you never go up to him and talk to him? No, I hide and just watch him after the play is over. I tell myself I'll go up to him and talk to him. I say that every time. But then I get nervous. What would you say to him if you had the courage? I don't know. I'd probably apologize. If the woman in that play is a carbon copy of me, I must have been awful to live with. I want him to know that I never meant to hurt him. I was angry and disappointed in him, but I loved him. At least until the very end. I just wanted him to do something with his life. But it was never my intention to humiliate him. You still consider him, what you called him, a bloody wimp? No, my husband was. My ex-husband wasn't. Now I understand why he didn't want anything from me in the divorce. He wasn't just trying to prove to me that he could do without me. He was forging his own path. He had his own way. I only wish I'd been there to help him instead of holding him back. Maybe you did help him. Again? Maybe the fact that he was married to you helped him. He didn't have the desperation that drives artists. Many great works of art and literature have come out of times of emotional turmoil. Look at all the great works of people who survived the Holocaust, slavery, or the Great Depression. Living in your home and eating your food, you did not experience the despair that should have produced that spark. Perhaps the collapse of your marriage gave him what he needed to find himself. But I'm a cave girl. Maybe, I agreed with her. But a cave girl helped a man find himself, didn't she? She looked at me with a contorted face. So what are you saying? Are you saying he should thank me? No, Kat, absolutely not. But I think you should try to talk to him and say whatever you need to say. And then you should forgive yourself. I paused to observe her. She snorted, wiping herself with the tissues left over from previous bouts of crying. I continued. That's why you're here, isn't it? Because you haven't forgiven yourself. All that anger you feel about him being a wimp is just crowding out your real focus. He was never a wuss. He was just unmotivated. You're angry because you weren't the one who motivated him. Not before you broke his heart. Yes, she said in a breaking voice, breaking into more sobs. I was his wife. I was supposed to be there for him. We were supposed to celebrate together. Well, then I guess you know what you have to do when you see this play for the 4th time. It sounds like you have something to say to him. But what if he doesn't want to see me? What if he rejects me? No. Considering the fact that you've been rejecting him for almost a year now, I think you can handle a little karma. A big bad lawyer like you. She grinned crookedly. I think so, Dr. Carter. We both stood up and I let her put her arm around me. You're going to be okay, Kat, I whispered in her ear, stroking her back reassuringly. Thank you, Beth. Thank you so much. Kat, the next night. For the 4th time this week, I listened to the thunderous applause the actors applauded. For the 4th time, the actors called my ex-husband to the stage to bow with them. And for the 4th time, I cried. When everything quieted down and people began to go home, I stood in the corner and watched him interact with the guests in the audience. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn around and run back to the car, but my heart demanded that I stay. I needed to talk to him. When the crowd dispersed, I headed toward him. He noticed me when I was a few steps away, and I saw his smile fade. His eyes were trying to comprehend what he'd seen. "Hello, Bran," I said meekly. I didn't mean it to sound that way. It just sounded that way. "Kat? Hi. Didn't expect to see you." "All right." "Yeah, but I was in town and thought I'd check out your theater. I've heard great things about it." Confused, he asked, "Really? You were in town? All the way here?" My brain weakly tried to come up with a plausible scenario as to how I could have ended up so far from home. When no options came to mind, I decided to humble myself and just tell the truth. "Actually, no. I'm lying. The only reason I'm in town is to see you, just like I was here last night and the night before." He froze in place. "You came to see me?" he asked incredulously. "Why?" I took a deep breath. This conversation was shaping up better than I thought it would. I hadn't expected it to go this far. I had a lot of scenarios running through my head. One of them even ended with him violently grabbing me and throwing me out. "I have to tell you something, especially now after seeing you play. I was hoping we could go out and, you know, talk a little." My voice sounded nervous and unsure. It was so uncharacteristic of me that he was wary. He looked at me as if he was trying to figure out a complex equation written on my forehead. I wanted him to see that I was calm, so I added, "Please, Bran, I won't take up too much of your time." He decided to take my words at face value. "All right then. Yeah. Let me tell Peyton where I'm going, and then we can grab a bite to eat." "Okay, I'll wait over there," I said, pointing to my seat. He nodded and stepped back. I sat down in my seat and watched his brief conversation with a petite woman holding a clipboard. She looked a bit like Hermione from Harry Potter, only with glasses. She glanced in my direction a couple times during the conversation. They seemed to be comfortable with each other. The way they interacted seemed familiar and at ease. I realized how comfortable they were when they kissed before he walked over to me. "Okay, Kat, I'm ready to go," he said as he put on his coat and scarf. I got up from my chair and followed him out of the theater. "So what brings you here?" he asked, swallowing a bite of his disgusting roast beef sandwich. I stuck my fork into my salad, watching him. I'd rehearsed this moment so many times, like I was preparing to testify on the eve of an important case. I knew what I had to say, but right now, nothing. Emptiness. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry." It was all I could say. He nodded and sighed, looking away. Silence fell between us. Neither of us knew where to take this conversation. There were so many unspoken words between us, so much unspoken pain. It was impossible to know where to begin. "You hurt me, Kat," he finally said. Simple. Everything we'd tried to say to each other fit into those 4 words. "I know. I look back and I, I, I said, unable to hold back the tears that were starting to come to my eyes. Bran looked at me and nodded. "Yes, me too." There was silence around us again. Once again, Brandon got behind the wheel. "What did you think of my play?" he asked, changing a mood that was threatening to turn somber. My face lit up. "Oh my God, I really liked it. Honestly, I didn't know you had it in you." I didn't mean for that last statement to sound the way it did. It was supposed to be a compliment, but instead, it sounded like I didn't believe it at all. "I meant that I didn't know you wrote plays. I thought you only wrote novels." I said this, quickly trying to clean myself up. I sat there hoping he would buy it instead of focusing on my Freudian slip. "Well, a wise man once told me that if I'm doing the best I can and publishers still turn me down, then maybe I should try something else." There was humor in his voice. He even smiled. I breathed a sigh of relief. "Looks like this wise man is smart. Probably went to Stanford," I joked back. And then a cloud came over me as I added, "Even if she was a bitch." We sat in awkward silence again. He wasn't going to dispute the fact that I was a bitch, nor did I expect him to, but I secretly hoped he would. "Bran, am I the woman in the cave?" I asked after a strange silence. I wasn't sure I wanted him to confirm it, but I needed to know. He nodded. "Yes, well, partly. When I first started writing the play, it was you. But as I was finishing it, an epiphany came over me. I realized that a lot of what you were saying, I was thinking about myself. That is, I didn't think I was weak, but I was unmotivated. I inwardly flinched when he said the last sentence, but he didn't notice it. He just kept talking. I was content to sit around and wait for someone to knock on my door and provide me with a golden opportunity. It wasn't until we got divorced that I was able to have an epiphany. Of course, after going through all that rage, it was like I was surrounded by you and your stuff and I couldn't see myself. Does that make sense? I nodded. Yeah, I get it. My biggest regret is that I didn't find a way to motivate you without being such a bitch. I just saw so much potential in you. I thought you were wasting it, and I resented that. And then what happened to Terry happened. Anger flashed across his face. Yeah, I definitely could have done without that. I know. You didn't deserve that. I wish I could go back and do it all over again. He didn't say anything back, and we fell into silence again. I fought my thoughts to get us out of this quagmire. I didn't want to reopen old wounds. So who was that girl you were talking to? Is there a new Mrs. Kerrigan in the life of the handsome young playwright? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. No, not yet, but soon there will be, he replied with a boyish smile. Soon? I interjected. He nodded. Yes, her name is Peyton. I met her at a local coffee shop. She works in the poetry room. I found her by accident one day, and I've been going there ever since. It's become my sanctuary. Listening to people express themselves in poetry helped me when I was at rock bottom. I'm sorry, Bran, I repeated for what seemed like the billionth time. Guilt swept over me again. He waved his hand dismissively. Water under the bridge. Besides, that's how I met Payday. Payday? I asked incredulously. He laughed. You're calling her Payday? You're kidding, right? He shook his head and took a sip of his drink. I covered my eyes with my hand like I was embarrassed and asked, What is it with you and these corny nicknames? His mouth dropped open and he mockingly feigned offense. Whatever, but don't pretend you didn't like Kitty Cat. I made a grimace, as if I smelled something wrong, and shook my head. That set off another fit of laughter on his part. You're a liar. We started making noise and people started looking at our table, so we calmed down. When we were able to act like adults again, he said, It was Payday who suggested I write plays. Really? He took another sip of soda and continued. Yeah, when I showed her all the books I'd written, she wasn't too complimentary of me. It would have been more correct to say brutally honest, with the emphasis on the brutally. Well, we both know how you like brutally honest women, I joked. Maybe I'm a masochist, he said with a laugh. On the other hand, she did give me some good points. She said the reason it didn't work out for them was because there was too much dialogue and not enough context. The format is more for actors and actresses. That lit a light bulb in my head, and 6 months later, I had my first play. The Woman in the Cave? Hell no. My first play sucked. Peyton told me so with a candor that almost rivaled, what did you call me? A wuss? An embarrassed, apologetic expression came back on my face. But along with the criticism, she gave a lot of good comments and encouragement. About a year after that, I had a play come out. She read it, thought it was great, and helped me direct it. She even acted as director. Now people everywhere are asking to direct it. Wow, what a great job Bran did, I said admiringly, sincerely. Truth be told, I felt a sense of jealousy hearing how she had helped him realize his dream in a way I couldn't. She really motivated him, believed in him to the point where she made it her mission to help him succeed. She didn't just tell him the mistakes in his dream, she showed him how to fix them. As I drove here, I didn't know what to expect from our conversation. Some part of me was hoping he wasn't dating anyone. I was a little disappointed when I found out. But at the same time, a huge weight was lifted off my shoulders. It was nice to see him happy. There was something about him that was different from when we were married. The swagger that comes out in a man when he knows he's doing what he's good at. He was the Brandon I knew he could be. Peyton sounds wonderful, I said, taking his hand that was resting on the table. Thank you, Kat. That means a lot. When I finally pulled my hand away, he asked, What about you? How are you doing? Is there anyone special? I shook my head. No, nothing special, but I quit my job at the firm. What? Why? It's a long story. Long story short, I was promoted to senior partner. He shook his head. Damn, Kat, I know how hard you worked on that. I think they lost big on this one, he said. I honestly believed he was being sincere. Yeah, stuff happens, you know. But I quickly found a job at another firm. I took a slight pay cut, but it was almost unnoticeable because my ex-husband was a stubborn jerk who refused to pay child support. You're welcome, he joked smugly. Never mind. Anyway, right now I'm very focused on my career. There's a lot more room for growth where I am, and I intend to pursue it. That doesn't leave much room for relationships. If Mr. Right shows up, then fine. If he's happy to concede to my goals, we can give it a try. But I'm not on a quest. I'm fine where I am. I said this with a smile. He nodded and looked at me in a way that I realized. He was genuinely happy for me. Good. We talked for another couple hours. We talked about everything. He talked about the new people in his life. I talked about a few cases I was working on. Like I said, he was a very good conversationalist. I was disappointed when it was over. I didn't want to leave him. If I'm being honest with myself, a big part of me missed him and what he brought to my life. Brandon and I definitely could have done better. But he was happy in the new life he had found. It suited him, and I was happy for him. As I drove home, I felt better than I had in a long time. I knew that Brandon had forgiven me, and that really helped me forgive myself. I may have been his girlfriend in the cave, but it wasn't the end for both of us. A man who lives life to the fullest, learns from the past, lives in the present, and plans for the future. What more could you ask for? Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next videos.